All right. Good morning, everybody. I can see that my camera is lagging a little, so don't look at me, look at the slides. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our 5th Fair Farms webinar for 2023. Today, we're going to be looking at the very serious topic of the new Industrial Manslaughter Legislation. What we understand about this is that there is an overarching federal legislation similar to work health and safety legislation. So there is now national legislation that bill is currently before Parliament, and then that will kind of sit across the top of all of the various state legislations where they exist. So we're going to talk a little bit about how it came to be, what it involves, and there are some fairly serious issues to consider here moving forward. And then at the end, we'll talk about just a few tips about what we need to do. The other thing is I will at the end just talk very, very briefly for 1 minute and 2 slides about the recent pay increase. Okay, let's kick off. We may have a few more coming in as we move along, but that's fine. The first thing, of course, that we'd like to do is acknowledge the stories, traditions and living cultures of our First Nations people. We recognise their connection to land and the environment and celebrate their care for country for over 60,000 years. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we value their skills and knowledge as our first horticulturalists and look forward to learning with a persistent curiosity. Okay. Workplace manslaughter is now a jailable offence, and we have already had at least one example of somebody being sent to prison on charges of industrial manslaughter. So it can be defined quite simply as a crime where the action or inaction of an employer results in the death of an employee. Effectively, we've had a very strong push federally for federal laws to cover this issue. So they have provided a clarifying definition here. So it is an offence where an employer, that is a person conducting a business or undertaking, should have known that any act or omission constituting a breach of their duties, you understand you have those key work health and safety duties, that a breach of, a breach of those duties would create a substantial risk of serious harm. So the first measuring point there is understanding what your obligations are and understanding that if you don't meet those obligations, it is likely to result in serious harm. To establish industrial manslaughter, however, the breach of duties must then cause the death of the person to whom the obligation is owed, i.e. your employees. Pardon me. These changes, as I said, don't replace existing legislation, but extends the existing duty of care to be more specific and is specifically targeted to workplace incidents. Just to give you a picture of how big this issue is in our industry, I pulled this down off the National Work Health and Safety website, and what you can see here is preliminary worker deaths by industry. So this is up until June of last year. And what we can see is in agriculture, forestry and fishing, we had 20 deaths, compared to construction where there were 10. Now, construction is always considered to be a high-risk industry, and in fact, a lot of this legislation was written with construction in mind. But when you look at these numbers, it's quite clear that agricultural industries have higher rates of worker deaths than construction. And then when you go down a little bit, you'll see transport, postal and warehousing deaths are 35, and that is very alarming. And I think that possibly particularly relates to warehousing operations. What we seem to have is a lot of deaths related to misuse of forklifts. So you will see some of that imagery throughout today. Just to remind people about how dangerous those things can be. So what we see is in agriculture, we have a significant and far too high rate of fatality of our workers, and this requires us to look more closely at what we do. So the offence of industrial manslaughter is broken down into these fundamentals. So they must be a body corporate or a person who is not an employee or a volunteer. And I've highlighted that volunteer for one reason, that when we get to the case study, we'll see that individual was actually volunteering for a mate of his. However, he did not meet the definition of volunteer. He was the employer was prosecuted. So there must be a body corporate or a person who is not an employee or a volunteer. And that's because employees and volunteers don't have management over how work health and safety is managed on site. So the victim must have been owed the specific duty of care under the relevant state or territory legislation. So that's the work health and safety legislation in each state. Those charged breach the duty by reckless and or negligent conduct, and that's where the language gets very specific. And there needs to be proof around reckless conduct and negligent conduct. The breach of duty caused the death of the victim. And if the person charged is a natural person, they must have acted consciously and voluntarily at the time of the breach. So that is that they will have understood or should have understood that the breach of their duty of care was going to cause an injury, and they pushed forward nonetheless. It is a criminal offence now. It was an offence always, and there were category 1, 2 and 3 offences in relation to death and serious injury, but it is now a criminal offence and is included in the criminal acts. The penalties are severe, including imprisonment and very hefty fines. So the increased prospect of prosecution and the first individual conviction for industrial manslaughter in June of 2022 strongly highlights the need for employers now to be aware of the potential for prosecution and the risks, not only to the business, but to the persons controlling the business. And I used to use a phrase, when I was talking to employers around work health and safety. And it was, when you're talking with your employees, you need to keep it in your head that you cannot allow what they do to put your business at risk, your livelihood. So this is why it is so important to be working really closely with your workers around work health and safety. So negligent employers who expose workers to serious risks in the workplace will face serious penalties under these new laws. Negligence is a fault element, so it lowers the bar for conviction. There's none of this. You have to prove that you had not done something or that you had done something. The truth of the matter is that negligence in work health and safety is not that difficult to prove if you are not across those detailed provisions in the acts. However, what's interesting here also is that the laws now prohibit employers from using insurance to cover financial penalties that are incurred for work health and safety fines. So that this is about ensuring that the fines act as a proper deterrent rather than just another cost of doing business. Now, there is a bit of a rider with that. So while it is an offence for a person or an organisation to enter into or to provide an insurance contract or some other arrangement for indemnification or monetary penalty. So you cannot have insurance that is going to pay your fines. That will not be allowed. However, the legal and investigation costs of defence are insurable. So the money that you need to spend in your legal representation and any other things that you need to prepare for the case, you can be insured for those costs. You simply cannot be insured for a penalty cost. And that's a very important change. So who is liable for prosecution under these laws? Directors and secretaries of companies. And be mindful that individuals can be held individually liable, and that includes some of these official positions within companies. So directors and secretaries, partners of the partnership, statutory authorities like government bodies, unincorporated and incorporated associations. Beg your pardon, I keep doing that. sorry. And trustees for a trust, or the trust that may well be a company or an individual. So a trust is a trustee for a company or a partnership. So that is any person who makes a significant decision in the running of the company, including potentially financial decisions of the company. So whoever is involved in making those major decisions for the company are going to be liable for prosecution under this legislation. And some of these people may not even be directly engaged in work health and safety on site. So it's really important to understand that these laws are very broad ranging in their application. Ostensibly, employees and volunteers, as I said earlier, are excluded for the legislation on the basis that they don't have the management or the control of the workplace to make some of those key decisions. But as we said before, there are some exceptions to that. So when we look at the status of state industrial manslaughter laws, what we see is that WA now has it, NT has it, Queensland was the first cab off the rank, I think. Victoria, ACT have it. South Australia is looking at it. There is a bill before Parliament at the moment, and that's probably going to move forward fairly quickly. The only state that doesn't have any is Tasmania, which is where I'm actually talking to you from today. So there are at this stage, no industrial manslaughter laws in Tasmania, but given that the national legislation is in place, I expect that to change. So we know that the laws now exist in most states as well as federally. So the federal approach, in March, the state, territory and federal ministers agreed by majority to adopt industrial manslaughter under the model work health and safety laws. We know that there are those model work health and safety national laws that exist, which reflect the recommendations out of the Boland Review. So the Boland Review was a major investigation into the work health and safety laws by Marie Boland in 2017, and she released her report in 2018. And this legislation is a result of the recommendations from that report. So the ministers agreed to amend the Model Act to include a jurisdictional note and a model penalty dealing with industrial manslaughter. And under the model, the body corporate found guilty for industrial manslaughter should face penalties of up to $18 million, with individuals liable for up to 20 years in prison. So you can see how serious the government is about dealing with the frightening number of deaths in the workplace. The unions used to have a phrase many, many years ago, and they put it onto badges, and it said, "I came here to work, not to die." Something to remember. Okay, so let's have a look at the states and what exists in terms of penalties in the states. So in Queensland, the offence came into being on the 23rd of October in 2017. So we've had this legislation in place in Queensland for a number of years. Again, it's an offence for a PCBU or senior officer to negligently cause the death of a worker, including where a worker is injured carrying out work and then later dies as a result of those injuries. In Queensland, the maximum penalty is 20 years imprisonment for an individual and $10 million for companies. And these vary. In New South Wales, there's a bill in place actually in New South Wales at the moment, and under that proposed legislation, the offence is committed if a person dies at the workplace or is injured and later dies, and the PCBU or the senior officer's conduct caused the death. The senior officer, PCBU, must have engaged in the conduct without a reasonable excuse and have been grossly negligent or reckless. So this language comes up in all of the legislation. It's just the wording and the application that is slightly different. The maximum penalty in New South Wales is up to 25 years imprisonment for an individual and $10 million to $995,000 for a company. So again, another $10 million fine. In South Australia, the bill was introduced in 2020 for the offence of industrial manslaughter, and that was the result of a private member's bill. Again, they would commit the offence if they were in breach of their duty of care and that breach caused the death of a worker or injury that later led to death. They also had to be recklessly indifferent. as to whether their conduct would create a substantial risk of serious harm. What's going to be interesting is how some of this terminology is interpreted within court cases. So the South Australia Government is currently considering feedback on its draft bill, Industrial Manslaughter Bill, and there was some public consultation earlier this year. So we'd expect to see some outcomes of that later this year or perhaps early next year. In the Territory, the offence came in 2020. Again, if they intentionally engage in conduct which breaches a health and safety duty and causes the death of an individual to whom that duty was owed, they must also be reckless or negligent about the conduct breaching the health and safety duty, and the maximum penalty is imprisonment for life, with individual fines of, again, 10 million or more for companies. So we can see this, the seriousness of this matter by the length of the prison terms that are being proposed. In Victoria, the offence came in 2020. Similarly, if they engage in a conduct that is negligent, constitutes a breach of an applicable duty under the Act, and causes the death. The Victorian offence carries a maximum penalty of up to 25 years imprisonment and fines of up to $18 million for companies. So they're getting closer to that national suggested standard of around $20 million. In Western Australia, it commenced in 2022 as part of the Work Health and Safety Act. Again, it applies to those who have a duty under the Act and fail to comply. And the PCBU can be a sole trader, a partner, each partner within a partnership, company, unincorporated association, government department or public corporation. And the fines, I'm sorry I didn't put them in there, are over the $10 million mark. Okay, so let's just look at one case study. And this is the one where I'd talked about this question about a volunteer. This person could not be defined as a volunteer because he wasn't working as a volunteer for an organisation which uses volunteers. He was volunteering his assistance to a friend, and this would make this particularly difficult, I imagine, for everybody involved in this particular case. So it's a successful prosecution. At this stage, it's the only one in Australia for industrial manslaughter. And happened at a Brisbane recycling an auto recyclers in June 2020. The charge related to the death of a volunteer worker who suffered fatal injuries after being struck by a portable generator that was being unloaded by a forklift. That forklift had been overloaded by the employer, and that forklift then flipped over and killed that individual. During the trial, the court heard evidence that at the time of the incident, the employer was operating a forklift despite not holding a licence. And we know that you must have a forklift licence to be able to use one of those machines. The generator that they were attempting to lift was heavier than the forklift could manage, so there was no risk assessment done whatsoever of this particular task. And another worker, sorry, I didn't mean to laugh, another worker was directed to stand on the back of the forklift as a counterweight. What could possibly go wrong? The employer also had no documented safety procedures for using the forklift. That's your safe work practices. To unload heavy equipment, and the business safety systems were lacking at the time of the incident. So this was a perfect storm of bad practice. And I swear, if anybody can give me one word why this occurs by the end of this seminar, we're going to send them a Fair Farms gift pack. There is one word that constantly comes up when these types of accidents occur, and you'll know what that is. So if anybody can tell me what that word is, we will reward you. So the jury returned a guilty verdict on the 25th of March last year. The company was fined $3 million, and Owen, the employer, was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment to be suspended after serving 18 months in a correctional facility. He was literally taken from the courthouse to jail. That would be a very sobering event for his entire family, I imagine. In reaching that guilty verdict, the jury had to be satisfied around the following elements under Section 34C. The volunteer was a worker at the business. That is, he wasn't a volunteer because he couldn't be defined as a volunteer due to the nature of this business. He was just helping out. The worker died in the course of carrying out work for that business. So despite not even being covered by that employer's workers' compensation, the worker was considered to be a worker at the time of the accident. The employer's conduct caused the worker's death. So the actions that were taken in relation to overloading that forklift, using people as counterweights, not doing any safety precautions, all of that contributed to that worker's death, and that Owen, the employer, was negligent in causing that death. Now, this case serves as a critical reminder for employers to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of their workers. And we'll have some tips at the end of this for what we think you might need to be doing. So the lessons that we're learning from this is undertaking adequate hazard identification and risk assessment. Adoption of safe systems of work, keeping records to confirm that you're doing this so that everybody understands what is required, everybody understands the practice before undertaking any high-risk work, and that all reasonably practicable steps are taken in discharge of its primary duty of care to the workers. These actions, every action that you take that leads to or leads up to an event, an incident, an accident, and particularly a serious accident or one causing death, will be closely scrutinised by the regulator in the event of the incident. So the work health and safety inspectors will be looking at every single thing that you do in relation to work health and safety. So bearing in mind that your primary duty is to ensure the provision and maintenance of a work environment without risks to health and safety, the provision and maintenance of safe plant and substances, and also safe work practices that go with that plant, with that machinery, the provision and maintenance of safe systems of work, and the provision of adequate supervision, instruction, and training. And that includes working with your employees. They're often in the best place, they're often best placed rather, to understand the hazards, to understand what risks those hazards provide or cause, and to help you come up with practical and reasonable solutions to those problems. It's really important that you work with your employees. Work health and safety leaders at work can influence other people's attitudes and behaviours. We know that to be true. So leadership in work health and safety on farm in particular, given the kind of stats that we looked at earlier, is really important. And you can do that through formal roles. So whether you have a consultation committee, a work health and safety committee, establishing proper positions, so work health and safety managers or supervisors, along with your fire wardens, your emergency planning officers, through formal roles and formal meetings. And you can do that through your own personal influence. Monkey see, monkey do. So you role model behaviours. If you get onto a quad bike without a helmet, then there's no reason why your employees would wear a helmet when riding quad bikes. If you seek to overload a forklift, then employees will think that that is okay. So you cannot be directing employees to do something that is dangerous and or illegal. But you also have to model these positive behaviours through your leadership on the work site. So they can be at all levels of the organisation, whether it's yourself as the employer or a senior executive, a farm manager, a plant manager, a shed manager. In fact, all of these people should be involved in work health and safety on farm. Middle managers, site managers, frontline supervisors, team leaders, even a more experienced team member if you have a smaller work site. You need to nominate somebody who will oversee the work health and safety and assist to implement your best practices. When you're a leader who promotes work health and safety, you get better outcomes and a much improved safety culture. So when we talk about culture, we're talking about your organisational culture. And this again hinges on your leadership of these issues. It's made up of the values and behaviours that your workers share and demonstrate. So those shared attitudes and beliefs in your workplace, written and unwritten rules, make work health and safety second nature. No one has to stop and think about it. It comes as second nature. So if workers know that their leaders place a high importance on work health and safety, it just becomes part of everyday work. Workers are more likely to follow safety procedures and raise safety issues, making health and safety part of your culture. There's our signs. I only put those there just to break it. But these are some of the issues, obviously, that can lead to serious injuries and death. So what now? Have a look at your safety culture. Do you have one? Do you have a work health and safety culture in your organisation where people actually think about work health and safety as a matter of course? Is everybody on the same page? So are you leading, and are your employees following you? Are you modelling behaviour that your employees are now also modelling? Do they understand the seriousness of some of these issues, and the risk to them and to your business? Again, we will not have employees putting our business at risk by behaving in an unsafe manner. So review your hazard identification and your risk assessment procedures. Just go back when you have a moment, even if you don't make time. Go back, have a look at what your policies say, have a look at your safe work procedures. Get people, have a forum, have people come to you with things that they think might cause serious injury or worse, and then have a bit of a forum to sit down and work out how you're going to address this. Again, review your safe work procedures to ensure that they're adequate, that they're appropriate, and that they're being followed. Again, we don't put things on a shelf. If we have a safe work process, we make sure that anybody who is involved in that work understands that safe work process and follows it. And there should be repercussions for employees who willfully or otherwise breach work health and safety policy. Do not let this stuff slide. You need to be picking people up, even on the smallest things, because the smallest things turn into the biggest things. So if you see something, anything, even if it's minor, and you know it doesn't follow policy or procedures, then please make a note, pick it up with the person, and make a note to ensure that everybody understands the right way of doing things. This is about talking with your workers. Consult, discuss, plan, and implement. It is a joint activity. And also, if you have labour hire companies and workers on your property, you need to work with your labour hire company to ensure that they understand your on-site work health and safety, and you need to jointly provide the work health and safety training on-site for those workers. They work on different farms quite regularly, so things may be different on one farm to the next. Invest in work health and safety. It's worth it. Invest in some training of work health and safety managers or supervisors, and invest in employee health and safety representatives. Those representatives have formal obligations and formal duties under the Act, and that includes putting a stop to work if they consider that the work is too dangerous to undertake. So again, work with your employees. Review the code of practice. Work Health and Safety Australia has a code of practice around consultation coordination. Have a look at, and I've provided the resources at the end of this. So have a look at that code of practice. Just familiarise yourself with some of the actions recommended in that code. It's got a lot of helpful advice and some templates as well. So have a look at that code of practice and see if you can't implement those guidelines. So our sources and references. What is industrial manslaughter? I've just included a few references. There's a bit of a webinar there that talks specifically around the prohibition of insurance. There's one that talks about specifically quite a concise article around what you need to know. And then obviously the WorkSafe Australia code of practice around consultation, cooperation and coordination. Okay, now we've got some questions here. If I'm a volunteer on an incorporated association board, does this mean I exempt all class? I suspect as incorporated associations are included in this Act, that you may well be, if you are an elected official or a nominated official, you may well carry some of that responsibility, just because you carry a position of authority. So it would be worth understanding what level of authority your position holds if you are able to make a difference to work health and safety in that incorporated association. Then you may well find yourself liable in that role. We can follow that up and see if we can't get some better clarification on that. The second one, thank you, Paul. Could a designated work health and safety manager be subject to industrial manslaughter? Would they be treated? Yes, they could well be treated as an officer of the business. It depends, again, on how much authority. If they were making recommendations to improve safety at the business and the business owner said, no, we can't afford to do that, that may well be a reasonable defence. But if that work health and safety officer is responsible for the safety of workers, they could well be drawn into a claim. So it's possible. We haven't seen any incidents of this yet. We've only got the one prosecution of a business owner, and obviously those business owners will carry the majority or probably the biggest liabilities. But it seems to me that you can have company secretaries and other officers, so it may well be possible. Okay, please have a look at those resources and familiarise yourself with those issues, and go back and just give some consideration to this, because if you need to make amendments, I'd be doing it sooner rather than later. Okay, now look, I just wanted to have a quick note, just because we've had the recent wage increase. I wasn't going to do a full webinar on the wage increases. It's a very curious outcome, to say the least. But the Commission has announced the national minimum wage. Don't confuse the national minimum wage with the award wages. There is such a thing as a national minimum wage. So that's been increased to $882.80 a week and $23.23 per hour. And that represents that actually represents the 8.6% increase to the national minimum wage. And there was a technicality around that increase that related to an old classification structure. What applies to workers under the Horticultural Award is the 5.75% increase. So that's to the minimum award wages. So the national minimum wage, strangely enough, is now higher than the level 1 rate in the Horticultural Award. And my comment, I think, on hearing that or realising that was that potentially puts growers in a bit of an ethical quandary. Clearly, you are entitled, you're only obliged to pay that level 1 rate for those level 1 employees for a limited period of time, but there's bound to be some media around this. So this is where it puts us. So it's an increase of $46.72 a week. So the full-time weekly, $859.32, the hourly rate, $22.61, and the casual hourly rate, $28.26, and that includes the casual loading. The wage salary guides, the wage guides, I looked last night, they weren't out yet. I'm surprised, they really should have been out 2 weeks before the first potential pay period after the 1st of July. But keep an eye, keep Googling Fair Work Commission pay rates for the Horticulture Award, and at some point those will come up, and we'll certainly get those out when we can. Okay, so just a quick note, have you joined Fair Farms yet? If you haven't, we want you to give some serious thought to it. It's Australian designed, so it's based on Australian standards as well as our global standards, and it's designed specifically for you guys. So it's designed specifically for horticulture. It's fully supported in its training and certification program. It is a full suite of training modules, which you can either do online with the online modules, or we can tailor and deliver that one-on-one. It's only $165. It's so cheap. The Fair Farms Manual has also recently been released, and that has all of the documentation that you could possibly need in order to meet the standards of the Fair Farms program. We have professional staff on call to assist you with your risk assessment, implementation, and all of your pre-audit preparation. We have checklists, we have templates, we have everything. So head over to the website and see how we can actually assist you to meet all of your compliance needs. And we can tell you the difference between Fair Farms and other programs if that's what you need to know as well. So there's just some testimonials. We've had some lovely words from some of our Fair Farms members. One from John Kaleo up at Black River Produce. Thank you, John. And from Kevin and David down at Dicky Bills. And effectively, people are really happy with the way, not only the way the standards are written, it's written in the same style as Fresh Care, so it's a very familiar process for growers, but also actually how we deliver the training and the certification, the pre-audit checklists and things like that. So we work really closely with our growers to ensure that we get you as close as we can to a successful audit. So thank you again. Oops, we're over the time. I apologise for that. Thank you once again for joining me. I'm in sunny Tasmania. Yes, it's sunny, but it is very cold out there. So a big shout out to all our people in Tasmania, all our Fair Farms members. Thank you for joining us around this very serious topic. Please give it some serious thought and watch this space for any further developments. Take good care in the cold weather. Our next webinar is on the 26th of July, and I have two topics that I'm thinking of, but I haven't yet decided. Nobody has come up with that word yet, so let me tell you what it is. It's complacency. If you are complacent around work health and safety, then you will run into trouble. Complacency is the biggest danger. I'll leave you with that. Thanks very much. We'll see you next month. Bye for now.